Really fun card there, UFC 328. Kind of caught me off guard here. I didn't see what a great card this was until just yesterday. And once I saw the card, I was like, wow, Joshua Vance, Sean Strickland, and I mean, really, that's what I want to talk about in this video, Joshua Vance and Sean Strickland, because that's really the two fighters who are on my mind here. What great performances from the two of them. Really a great day for strikers in the UFC, a great day for fans of striking and all the, fans of any fighter who leads with their striking in their game. Because, for so many years it's been case after case of, wrestling getting the job done in these big fights, and these fighters who lean on wrestling continuously winning these championship fights, to the point where I've become, very disenchanted with the UFC and very disenchanted with the matchmaking and with, just how often these big fights, these headlining UFC cards inevitably end up with, just a wrestling fest. And I'm sure we're going to see fights like that in the future, but some really great neutralization of takedowns here. Joshua Van, he stuffed the takedown in the second round of that fight, where I was like, oh man, we've got a fight on our hands now, because Tyra controlled the first round with the wrestling. I'm a huge Joshua Van fan. I think, anyone who's as big of a fan of boxing as I am is bound to be a fan of Joshua Van, just because of his skill set. That fight against Royval was still one of my favorite, UFC fights of all time, and it contained absolutely no grappling or wrestling at all that I can recall. But Tyra looked very, very in control of this fight. Tyra did a great job neutralizing Joshua Van, in my opinion. I came into this fight thinking that Tyra was, a future, contender level, championship level fight. I knew of Tyra's game. I was aware of how versatile and how deceptively tough he is for his size. Because a lot of times, flyweights and flyweights coming over from Japan, a lot of times they come over to the UFC and they're, hailed for their technique. And then in the UFC, they just get shown the levels of the game. And, Tyra, he's shown repeatedly that he is, above that level of fighter that we've seen in the past, that he's a whole new level of flyweight coming over from Japan into the UFC. And I believe that he could have a championship level future. And he showed that, I believe, in being able to control Joshua Van, who I consider to be one of my favorite flyweights of all time already. And I expect, if he, continues on in a championship reign like this, especially with the ability to neutralize takedowns and to neutralize grapplers, I expect him to have one of the best reigns in UFC flyweight champion, history, including Demetrius Johnson, including Alexandre Pantoja, just because of his pure entertainment value, his ability as a striker, his ability to control fights with his striking, his ability to control fights with his jab. He's a fighter I would love to see make a move over to boxing or make a move over into Muay Thai. Well, he's only 24. If someday, one day, somebody figures out how to actually make money off of a Muay Thai promotion on like one championship and actually pay fighters well, I'd love to see him, make an appearance in a big Muay Thai fight. But I'd also love to see him go over to boxing one day if he can't, get the pay that I think he deserves as a real superstar in the UFC, because he isn't just a superstar fighter in terms of his skill set, Joshua Van. He's a superstar in terms of his attitude, right? And both Joshua Van and Sean Strickland have that it factor and that attitude that people love and that really, gives a fighter a fan base. And just looking at the total strike stats here on ESPN for Sean Strickland, 165 out of 350. I scored this fight a draw, and I scored this fight a draw with giving Sean Strickland round 2, 10-8. Although, it is, I scored at 10-8 on his knockdown, and it is one of those sort of flash knockdowns in the UFC that's kind of hard to score, so I'm not sure. And I'm pretty sure not everybody scored it that way. Most people's scorecards would have hinged on round 5. And I scored round 5 for Chimaev. So with that 10-8 round 2 and scoring round 5 for Chimaev, I ended up having to fight a 47-47 draw, which is an unequal number of points, which what anybody scored it on the official scorecard. So I think I would have had it 47-46 Chimaev, which kind of makes me want to rewatch the fight, because looking at the fight stats and watching the fight, I kind of think Strickland won. And it's one of the rare fights where, and it's, why I prefer boxing scoring. Having 12 rounds, you have more subtlety, right, into scoring, and more detail. So I actually do kind of prefer boxing scoring at this point, which I kind of never thought I'd say when I started watching combat sports and, hated how many boxing fights seem to have BS decisions and were rigged. But there's a lot of bad decisions in MMA too. And especially with the 5-round format, it's just too loose. And that's also an issue with 5-minute rounds as well. Anyway, aside over, it's one of those rare fights where my scorecard differs from my actual, in-ring impression of the fighters in the fight, because I think that Strickland won the fight, especially when you consider how damaging of a wrestler is, how suffocating of a grappler Khamzat Chimaev is. And, you know, it's not that Strickland didn't seem unaffected by that, but he stayed in the fight, and he stayed in the fight, you know, to the point where he still had a significant amount of his ability. He was still, you know, close to the best version of himself all the way to the final bell of this fight, to the point where I think, you know, probably on a rewatch, I think I may have given him the last round of this fight, because that was a very, very close fight where they were both tired, and especially in MMA, those are hard rounds to score. But it's just like for one night, UFC fans can hold on to the dream that if you have enough of that dog in you, you can neutralize any wrestler in the world. You can take Khamzat Chimaev 0 if you have a big enough dog in you, if you're Sean Strickland. It's just about being determined enough. And, you know, that's probably not true at all. But for one night, all of us UFC fans can dream that one day the striking will win out for good. I'd also like to talk about Waldo Cortez Acosta versus Alexander Volkov. And, you know, it's cool that Volkov, after such a long career in the UFC, is going to finally get a chance at the top level, potentially here, calling out Pereira at the end of the fight. I don't know if that fight gets made necessarily. I don't know how marketable of a fighter necessarily Volkov is. But he's had a really long career. He's been a long-standing veteran. He's a super tough guy. Of course, underrated offensive skill set. Really great rangefinder, which is essential when you're a fighter of that size. But I actually scored this fight for Waldo Cortez Acosta 29-28. One of the judges scored it 30-27 for Volkov. It must have been a fight that looked different, that came off different in the building type deal. And the stats for Volkov look great here on ESPN.com, and I'm looking at right now. But watching the fight live and scoring it live, I personally thought that Cortez Acosta won round 1 and round 3, and maybe that was just me looking too much at the jab, paying too much attention to those strong jabs from Cortez Acosta, which I forgot that happened, by the way. I can't believe it. Van knocked down Tyra in the Van versus Tyra fight. Van knocked Tyra down with a jab. This is one of those badass things I've seen in the UFC. That's a lot less impressive in the UFC than it is in boxing because of the size of the gloves, but it's still incredibly badass that Joshua Van was able to do that to Tyra. He also landed a crazy knee that when I saw it was like, man, that was just like crazy and vicious. I was like, I can't believe that was legal. And then a few minutes later, the commentary was like, no, it's not. That wasn't a legal knee, but the ref just missed it. Sean Brady really dominated Joaquin Buckley, and the first fight on the main card was King Green. A great performance against Jeremy Stephens. Very, very dominant, very, very in control. Was really comfortable in there with his striking, and then finished it off with a sub. It was kind of like a fight where, you know, somebody breaks down the other fighter over 5 rounds and then finishes them, except it happened inside of 1 round. And it really was that way because Jeremy Stephens, honestly, it's disrespectful to say, but it's my impression. I mean, 23-loss fighter, 29-23 for Jeremy Stephens. He's washed up. He just is. He's washed up. And, you know, it's a good opponent to make an older fighter with a fun offensive skill set like King Green look good, right? That's the truth. But it's not to take anything away from King Green. He went in and did his job in there. But it's the sort of situation where I'm afraid that when they put him up there against, you know, a younger prospect, which is inevitable on a company like the UFC, he's going to be in trouble, which, you know, he's been in trouble against young prospects in the past. It's nothing new. King Green's a fighter. He has no problem with it. And it was just another entertaining fight, an entertaining finish for King Green, who's always been an entertaining fighter, and I love his style. It's very hands down. It's more hands down than is like possible or feasibly possible in boxing. And I'm going to be honest, the only undercard fight that I caught on this card was Atiba Gautier's first round knockout of Ozzy Diaz. But I thought that Gautier already fought Ozzy Diaz, but he was scheduled to, and the fight got canceled. But yeah, it was another great win for Atiba Gautier, but it was never a particularly challenging fight because I think that's a fighter that Gautier has really significant physical advantages over. Not that Gautier doesn't have physical advantages over pretty much everybody in the middleweight division. He's still a physical freak and probably will be for the rest of his UFC career. He's one of those really guaranteed sort of locked-in prospects where I sort of can't wait till he's up at contender championship level to really see how he does against the elites, because you don't really know the nuances of somebody's game when they're that dominant, right? Gautier is kind of still just blowing through people at this point. And anybody that isn't like a real contender, you're not going to see any of the weaknesses of his game exposed because he's just going to be able to blow through you. But yeah, it was a long day of fights, you guys. Apologize if I'm a little low energy here, but we got 3 big videos off today. The UFC video, which I didn't even expect it to make because I didn't really make any coverage of this because I was pretty locked in on boxing on both on Dubois versus Wardley and that unfortunately canceled Angela Leo fight that were happening this weekend. And this fight just slipped under the radar because I haven't really been locked in on the UFC. But man, Joshua Van is one of my favorite fighters, and I'll always watch Sean Strickland, and especially a chance to knock off Khamzat Chimaev and take his 0. I think it's always a good time. Not that I have any kind of like, super disdain for Dagestani wrestling inherently. It's more about how that style of wrestling just has been able to pretty much completely neutralize striking at the elite level. And it's like, of course, props to it, but like, it is making these fights more boring. It's making them more predictable. It's making them more one-sided. And there's just kind of always this presence of, one of these Dagestani wrestlers coming up to, take out your favorite fighter. And to a certain extent, you fear it in the Joshua Van fight. Even he's not even fighting a Dagestani. He's fighting a Japanese fighter who's, utilizing similar tactics and techniques. And you're like, you hype up all your friends on Joshua Van and he's getting wrestled by this guy for 25 minutes. And, it happens over and over again with strikers in the UFC. You're like, yeah, this guy's great. This guy's got hands. You should watch this guy fight. And then he's just getting wrestled for 25 minutes. And you're like, yeah, sorry, it's the guy he's fighting against. because it's the guy he's fighting against. So it's always great to see takedowns stuffed. It's great to see fighters being more active from the bottom as well. That was a big thing for Van. That was a big thing for Strickland. Being more disruptive when fighters have you under quote-unquote control. When you're on the bottom, just be more disruptive, throw more shots, move more, be more active. Stamina is useful for moving around the ring. It's useful for boxing. It's useful for kicking. It's useful for lasting the full 25 minutes. But it's also useful for being on the bottom. Your only job when you're on the bottom isn't just to survive. It's to, be a problem. And if you can, be the one landing the more significant shots. And to a certain extent, it's added a new layer of art to MMA. Now, that was always an art that was there, but it was more sort of under the surface, not something that everybody even practiced or thought about. And now I think it's becoming especially an essential part of the elite level of the game, and it's something that, these fighters are getting better at, even people like Joshua Van and Sean Strickland, whose games are more based around striking, but especially guys like Joshua Van and Sean Strickland, who, really have, like I said before, that dog in them, that it factor, that determination to win that makes you a fan favorite. And that's something that we saw, so much of today. You saw it in Fabio Wardley, even in a losing effort in the boxing ring, and you see it in Joshua Van. You see it in Sean Strickland. And yeah, man, it's awesome. Those were great fights. I would love to see a Joshua Van and Sean Strickland co-headlining card again, because that's just money in the bank. In terms of entertainment value. So yeah, guys, like and subscribe for more combat sports content. I'll be back very, very soon for more. I'll make a recap video for Dubois versus Wardley, a more in-depth video on the way for you guys. All right, peace out. I will see you guys very soon.